Many supporters of Donald Trump claimed that he would resist war and he would be a peace candidate. Well, now that Trump has won the US election and has announced who will be the secretaries in his cabinet who will oversee numerous US government ministries, we can see that without exception, they are all war hawks, and many of them are neoconservatives. So this shows how the neocon consensus in Washington continues. It doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House. This extreme pro-war foreign policy is continuing. First and foremost, Donald Trump has selected as Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the king of the neocons. He is a textbook example of a neoconservative. Marco Rubio has supported every single major U.S. war since he's been a politician, and he has constantly pushed for new wars. He called for the U.S. military to invade Venezuela. He supported the war in Libya. He supported the war in Syria. He supported bombing Syria, bombing Yemen. He wants to attack Iran. I mean, this is the exact opposite of a peace candidate. And he will now be overseeing the U.S. State Department, helping to create U.S. foreign policy. For his defense secretary, Donald Trump nominated another neocon, Pete Hegseth, who also is a pundit on Fox News. For his CIA director, Trump nominated John Ratcliffe, who's a neocon and an extreme China hawk. For his national security advisor, Donald Trump has named Mike Waltz, who is a neocon and an extreme China hawk. For his ambassador to the UN, Trump nominated another neocon, Elise Stefanik, who's an extreme far-right pro-Israel activist who's viciously anti-Palestinian. And I should point out that it's basically certain and guaranteed that all of these neocons that Trump has nominated will end up being the heads of their various government departments, because in order for a secretary in the cabinet to be officially appointed, they have to get the approval of the Senate, and the Republican Party won a majority in the Senate. So that essentially guarantees that all of Trump's picks will end up being the secretaries in his cabinet. And again, I need to stress, all of them are neocons. All of them are war hawks. And in particular, all of them are extremely anti-China, and they're going to push for more and more aggressive policies against China, significantly heating up the new Cold War against Beijing. Now, I have emphasized constantly here that the new Cold War against China is bipartisan, and let's not forget that in Trump's first term, he started a trade war against China, and Donald Trump voluntarily surrounded himself with many neocons. His Secretary of State and former CIA director was Mike Pompeo, a neocon. His national security advisor was John Bolton, another neocon and one of the architects of the Iraq War. And they carried out an extremely aggressive policy against China. Mike Pompeo basically called for overthrowing the Chinese government. And even though Pompeo and Bolton are not coming back in Trump's second term, because Trump considers them disloyal because they publicly criticized him, it's not because Trump is against the neocons. On the contrary, he's replaced Bolton and Pompeo with people who have the exact same neoconservative politics. Mike Waltz, John Ratcliffe, Marco Rubio, they agree with Bolton and Pompeo on basically everything. So this idea, this absurd idea that Donald Trump was going to resist war is nonsense. The only war he may actually end is the war in Ukraine. But why is that? If you listen to his rhetoric, if you listen to the neocons he's appointed, all of them say the same thing. They say, we should reduce tensions with Russia in order to carry out war on China. In fact, another person who's going to have a top position in Donald Trump's government is the former Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. And his entire foreign policy narrative that he campaigned on is that the U.S. should break the partnership between China and Russia in order to wage war on China. This is their narrative. None of them is against war. All of them want war on China, but what they say is that they're against war on Russia. And if you listen to the statements of Donald Trump's nominees for defense secretary, CIA director, secretary of state, UN ambassador, national security advisor, all of them are pushing for much more aggressive policies against China and eventually war. And although some of Trump's supporters claimed that he was the peace candidate and that if he was elected, he would end war, you have to ignore everything that Trump did during his first term to actually believe that. Because before I show clips of some of Trump's cabinet officials, I want to briefly review his foreign policy record during his first administration. If you look at what he did when he was president, it was not support peace. He expanded multiple wars, including the war in Yemen. He did not withdraw troops from Afghanistan. He boasted of militarily occupying Syria.
And then they say he left troops in Syria. You know what I did? I left troops to take the oil. I took the oil. The only troops I have are taking the oil. They're protecting the oil.
He also maintained an illegal military occupation of Iraq. He assassinated the top Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, and a top Iraqi military commander. He massively expanded illegal sanctions and economic warfare against Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and other countries. He waged a trade war on China. He massively expanded the new Cold War against China. He backed neo-colonial coup attempts in Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba and Bolivia, trying to overthrow their governments. He succeeded in overthrowing Bolivia's democratically elected left-wing government. Donald Trump's foreign policy was extremely interventionist, and his supporters claim that, he didn't start a new war. He started many new wars in terms of economic war, in terms of unconventional war, in terms of trying to overthrow foreign governments. He tried to overthrow the Iranian government. He tried to destabilize China. He backed numerous coup attempts in Latin America. He waged brutal economic war in Venezuela that led to tens of thousands of deaths. By the way, he also sold many weapons to Ukraine, and he boasted that he had sent more weapons to Ukraine that Obama had. He claimed that Obama only sent pillows and sheets to Ukraine.
I don't understand.
You don't know what I talked about with Putin in the meeting prior to the press conference?
Publicly. You never say anything harsh about him publicly.
I didn't. I'm the one that gave Ukraine offensive weapons and tank killers. Obama didn't. You know what he sent? He sent pillows and blankets.
And Donald Trump also tore up two different arms deals that the U.S. had previously signed with Russia, which is what made the proxy war in Ukraine much more likely. So Donald Trump in his first term was already a warmongering president, like Obama, like Biden and Harris. I mean, this is completely bipartisan. It's not like Trump is unique. But the point to emphasize is that Donald Trump is not an alternative. His populist rhetoric, claiming he's going to end the wars, is just cynical rhetoric to try to get votes. And it worked. A lot of people believed it, but it was false. Look at the people Donald Trump has surrounded himself. They are all mouth-foaming war hawks. And I'm going to show some clips today and some articles and tweets and statements by these neocons that Trump has appointed. And you will see that there is basically no difference between Trump's foreign policy and the foreign policy of the neocons who came before him. So now let's talk about Donald Trump's nominee for National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. He's a complete neocon. In this clip, he says that China, Russia, and Iran are the big enemies of the U.S., and they're trying to replace the U.S. global dictatorship, the U.S. superpower that tries to control the entire world. And he, of course, sees this as a very bad thing.
Our adversaries are openly on the march to try to replace the United States and the Western-led order along the lines of our values, open markets, free press, basic democracy, with their world order. And Chairman Xi of the Chinese Communist Party said it to Putin in their first gathering. He said, this is a moment of maximum opportunity that we haven't had in 100 years. And what he was talking about is the weakness shown in this White House from 4 years ago to now under President Trump, because he understood how to project strength. He understood deterrence. And most of all, he understood that our economy is our biggest and most forceful weapon and force for leverage. And if he would simply flood the world with cheap oil and gas, American oil and gas, because right now we have an LNG ban in place. You drive down those prices, you bankrupt Russia and Iran for that matter, and you dry up their war machine. But instead, Biden just wants to throw billions and billions of more weapons that our military needs as we try to deal with China into an endless situation.
That is the neocon that Trump picked to be his national security advisor. Mike Waltz has the exact same worldview as John Bolton, who was previously Trump's national security advisor in his first administration. There's basically no difference between Mike Waltz and John Bolton. He's not only against China, he's actually also against Russia. He says that he wants the U.S. to flood the global oil market in order to bankrupt Russia and Iran, which are major oil producers. And then he says that the U.S. should stop sending weapons to Ukraine because we need those weapons to wage war on China. So again, total neocon. No difference whatsoever between Trump and George Bush, or for that matter, between Trump and Biden. The neocons remain firmly in charge. Trump is no different whatsoever, despite his so-called populist rhetoric. Here's another example of an insane mouth-foaming conspiracy from this neocon Mike Waltz, in which he claims, without any evidence, it's completely false. He claims that China and Iran are working with Mexican drug cartels. Totally false. Listen to this insanity on Fox News.
These cartels now are connecting with our foreign adversaries and acting as proxies.
That is
the Iranians are working with them for assassination attempts, and I think most significantly are working with the Chinese Communist Party, who we know the Chinese know that these precursor chemicals are coming to certain ports in Mexico and are killing hundreds of thousands of Americans to weaken our inner cities, weaken middle America, and they're essentially acting as proxies for our greatest adversary. We've got to take it on. President Trump will do that.
And here's another clip of this neocon essentially calling for preparing for war with China. He claims that China is carrying out the world's biggest military buildup since the 1930s, and he calls for the U.S. military to take on both China and Iran. Now, keep in mind what happened in the 1930s. It led to World War II. So he's essentially saying that the U.S. military should prepare for war on both China and Iran.
The other thing that is the most dangerous since the 1930s, we are seeing the biggest military buildup in the world, in world history since the 30s, and that's with China. Tripling their nuclear arsenal, Navy now larger than ours, launching more into space than us and the rest of the world combined, where the ships that are in the Middle East are being shifted from the Pacific. So not only is it wearing out our military, reactive and not deterring Iran, but they're pulling from what should be deterring China.
So now let's look at comments from Donald Trump's nominee to be defense secretary, Pete Hegseth. He's another neocon, another warmonger, and what are his qualifications? I mean, he's a veteran, but really his only real qualification for Trump is that he was a Fox News pundit. And now he's going to be made head of the U.S. military, head of the Pentagon. Here is a clip of the future defense secretary on Fox News arguing that the U.S. has to break the partnership between China and Russia. And this is really going to be one of the main points of the Trump administration's foreign policy, is to try to woo Russia and put a wedge between Beijing and Moscow so the U.S. can try to isolate China to wage war on China. Here he is on Fox News hinting at that.
You got two really ambitious individuals here that lead two very powerful civilizations who want the future to be theirs, but they have one immovable object in front of them, and that's the United States of America. So do they try to fight against us independently, or do they slowly but surely start to come together to get rid of the West so that they can then figure out who's in charge in the future?
And that's why we're having this conversation, because that's what we've seen as of late, them coming together in opposition to the United States.
In another crazy Fox News segment, this neocon whom Trump appointed to be defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, he called on Trump during his first administration to bomb Iran. And he said that the U.S. should not only bomb military targets, he said that Trump should bomb Iranian cultural sites. And he said at the same time, so he's calling for Trump to target Iranian civilian areas. And then he also said that the U.S. should rewrite international law, rewrite the rules of war, in order to be advantageous to us. This is the definition of neoconservatism. It's ignoring international law, waging wars around the world, trying to rewrite the rules of the game in order to benefit the US empire in the name of spreading so-called freedom and democracy, overthrowing foreign governments, including overthrowing elected governments abroad. This is the same neoconservative status quo that Donald Trump has once again continued.
None of this, though, changes the calculation of this regime, which is an evil regime. So when I hear talk about, well, now it's time to get back to the table and talk, I say they need to come back to the table for talks on their nuclear capabilities. They need to come back limping and begging, not seething. I happen to believe that we can't kick the can down the road any longer in trying to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. So what better time than now to say, we're starting the clock. You've got a week. You've got X amount of time before we start taking out your energy production facilities. We take out key infrastructure. We take out your missile sites. We take out nuclear developments.
That is
we
not
take out
a popular idea.
capabilities. Or, you know what, take out a Quds headquarters while you're at it if you want. I understand that's not a popular idea. I don't want boots on the ground. I don't want occupation. I don't want endless war. But Iran has been in an endless war with us for 40 years. Either we put up and shut up now and stop it, or we kind of wait, go back to the table and let them dither while they attempt to continue to develop the capabilities to do precisely what they've said they want to do. So either we're honest about the nature of this regime, or I think we miss a moment.
But what do you know about these cultural sites? Because we're not supposed to be hitting cultural sites, but I understand, I've been hearing that we believe that the Iranians are hiding missiles and weapons in some of these cultural sites, churches,
of course they do.
Mosques.
This is what Islamists do. It's what they've done on the battlefield against folks like me and my entire generation. Human shields, using mosques, using hospitals, schools. This is what our enemies do. If we're going to fight to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb, this regime, then we need to rewrite the rules that are advantageous to us. I don't want to hit cultural sites on purpose, but if you're using one to harbor your most dangerous weapons, then that should be on the target list too.
Here's another clip of neocon Pete Hegseth, who will be Trump's defense secretary, on Fox News, fear-mongering about BRICS. And he complains that China and Russia are undermining America's global dominance, and in particular, the dictatorship of the US dollar. And he attacks BRICS. He says this is something bad. He's obviously not praising this. He says that we need to prevent BRICS from expanding and growing in influence, and prevent China and Russia from creating alternatives to the US-dominated global financial system, and to prevent other countries from freeing themselves from Washington's global dictatorship. And he says that the US should try to undermine BRICS, and in order to do so, again, divide China and Russia, all to try to save the dominance of the US empire and the US dollar.
The role Egypt plays in the Middle East, Indonesia, a massive country, Nigeria, Senegal, Thailand, not insignificant. Now, these are countries that have applied to join BRICS, some the same, Saudi Arabia, both. But a country like Iran, who's increasingly working with China and Russia, it's a new axis of evil against the United States of America. Could BRICS be effectively the finance hub for that? They're transacting in some ways in the yuan to compete against the dollar. You also get past sanctions. So why is BRICS significant? Think about the war in Ukraine. Neither India, Brazil, South Africa, or China have taken part in any way on sanctions against Russia. So if you want sanctions to be effective, they have to be as comprehensive as possible. If BRICS creates an alternate system where you can always circumvent sanctions, you've lost a massive tool. And that's exactly what China and Russia want against the United States.
They've got a bank designed to help out countries when they are in trouble. It's important to note, and I think that many of these countries have recognized the threat. BRICS is a starting point. It ends, by the way, with Chinese dominance. It is all backed by the Chinese yuan. It's all backed by potential Chinese power. They are the weight in that room.
History is not over, and they want to replace the United States and believe they can, especially if we're on our heels.
That is the neocon whom Trump has picked to be his defense secretary, saying that Iran, Russia, and China are the new axis of evil. That is the same discourse of neoconservative former President George Bush. Now he's the guy that Trump chose to oversee the Pentagon, oversee the US military. He complains that China and Russia are going around U.S. sanctions. He complains that they're providing a financial lifeline for countries so the U.S. can no longer suffocate them economically. Once again, there is going to be no difference between Donald Trump's foreign policy and the neocons who came before him. And another part of this neoconservative foreign policy that we're going to see under Trump is targeting Latin America, trying to reassert colonial control over Latin America in the name of countering China. And Trump's defense secretary nominee, Pete Hegseth, complained that, quote, China is now cozying up to Latin America, end quote. So the Trump administration is going to try to find ways to destabilize independent governments in Latin America that have close relations to China through organizing coup attempts. We saw this, for instance, under Trump. He backed a very violent coup attempt against Nicaragua's leftist government in 2018. And then in 2019, the Trump administration backed a very violent coup attempt in Venezuela. There was a failed invasion of Venezuela, trying to overthrow Venezuela's independent leftist anti-imperialist government. And then also in 2019, the Trump administration backed a successful coup against Bolivia's democratically elected left-wing government. And they're going to continue doing the same. This is especially the case now that we know that Marco Rubio is going to be Trump's Secretary of State, overseeing the State Department. Rubio is a textbook neocon. He basically shares the exact same worldview as John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, and he has obediently supported every single war. Not only supporting every war, but pushing for more and more war. In fact, back in 2019, when Trump was carrying out a coup attempt against Venezuela's government, Marco Rubio went even further, and he asked Trump to invade Venezuela. He said that he wanted a U.S. military invasion to overthrow Venezuela's independent leftist government. Marco Rubio is a neo-colonialist, and they're following the exact same ideology of John Bolton. In fact, in 2020, John Bolton published a book called The Room Where It Happened, where he discussed his experience as Donald Trump's national security advisor. And in that book, Bolton invoked the colonialist Monroe Doctrine. This is a 200-year-old colonial doctrine that essentially says that Latin America is the backyard of the United States and that the U.S. empire supposedly has the right to intervene in Latin America to overthrow independent governments in order to prevent so-called threats in the Western Hemisphere. And in his book, Bolton said that China, Russia, and Iran are so-called threats, and the U.S. empire will not allow any government in Latin America, whether or not it's democratically elected and popular, they don't care, they will not allow them to have close relations with China, Russia, and Iran. This is neocolonialism, and this is exactly the policy that Donald Trump had in his first term and is going to continue in his second term. If you look at the people around him, all of them are neocons and imperialists and warmongers. If you look at the statements that Marco Rubio makes publicly, you can see that he constantly is fear-mongering about China's growing and menacing influence in the Western Hemisphere. And most recently in November, he was fear-mongering about a port that China built in Peru, in South America, to expand trade between China and Latin America. And Marco Rubio is very clearly saying that the U.S. is going to prevent countries in Latin America from having close relations with China in this way. If you just take a glance at Marco Rubio's Twitter account, you can see that he is the most unhinged neocon out there. He's constantly tweeting, condemning Cuba, Nicaragua, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. I mean, this is the exact same foreign policy of John Bolton and George Bush. And Donald Trump has surrounded himself with these Bush-era neocons once again, just as he did in his first administration. Another part of the narrative that Trump and Rubio have been pushing is blaming China for deindustrialization in the U.S. and the loss of manufacturing jobs. It was U.S. companies, it was U.S. capitalists and billionaires who got rich by outsourcing, by offshoring jobs. They were the ones who did it. China did not force anyone to open factories in China to exploit low-paid Chinese workers. It wasn't China that was forcing U.S. companies to do that. They voluntarily went to do that. They wanted to do that. But now the ridiculous narrative of Trump and neocons like Rubio is that we have to scapegoat China. We have to blame China. And eventually what they're pushing for is war on China. That's the only so-called solution that they actually have. Rubio is such an unhinged neocon that just a few weeks before the elections in November, he claimed without any evidence that China, Iran, and Russia were trying to interfere in these U.S. elections. Again, no proof. I mean, he just is an insane neocon who lives on Mars in a fantasy land, and he just manufactures these Cold War conspiracies and has this McCarthyite paranoia. You can see this kind of McCarthyism in the comments that Marco Rubio has made on Fox News. This is an interview in September when he claimed that communist China is infiltrating U.S. businesses, universities, and the government. Here is this insane McCarthyism on Fox News.
The Chinese have figured out that the way to influence America is not necessarily at the federal level where there's a lot of scrutiny, and they're aiming at local governments, they're aiming at state government officials, at the business class, and universities, obviously, but they're really focusing very heavily now on local and state government. Mayors, commissioners, people at the county level, employees of local government, because there's not nearly enough scrutiny.
So you remember Russiagate, the ridiculous conspiracy that Putin was controlling Trump? Well, now that Trump's coming back, the Republicans, his new administration, are going to push Chinagate. They're going to accuse all of their opponents of secretly working for China. They're going to bring back a new McCarthyism, and they're also going to go after free speech. That's their next goal, is to stifle the free speech of people who are criticizing their warmongering against China, censoring people who say that the U.S. should not wage a new Cold War on China. As an example of this, here is Marco Rubio in the U.S. Congress claiming in September that China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Cuba are pushing so-called disinformation in the U.S. And why is he saying this? Because he wants to set the stage, the grounds for censoring people who are accused falsely by the U.S. regime of spreading disinformation or echoing disinformation on behalf of the boogeymen of the U.S. empire.
This is a tricky minefield. And it's even trickier now because Russia's still doing it more than anybody else. You don't need to have a big, expensive operation to pursue some of this. I think we should anticipate that in the years to come, and it's happening already, the Iranians are going to get into this. They already are. The Chinese are going to get into this business. They already are. And you see them using that in other countries to sow discord and division. It's coming. It's also North Korea.
Rubio is also threatening the U.S. southern neighbor Mexico, and he complained that China is trying to evade U.S. tariffs by instead rerouting products through Mexico, and he has introduced legislation to punish Mexico as well. So the Trump administration is going to even further expand neocolonial U.S. meddling in Latin America. And in fact, Trump's nominee for border czar, Tom Homan, said in an interview on Fox News that Donald Trump is going to send U.S. Special Operations Forces, the U.S. military, into Mexico, violating Mexican sovereignty in order to take out cartels, is what he claimed. This would be an invasion of Mexico. The Mexican government has said it very clearly. We do not support this. We are against a U.S. military intervention. This would be an illegal invasion of the U.S. southern neighbor. But Trump is fully on board for this. And the excuse they're using to justify this is the cartels, going after the cartels. But this is hilariously ironic because Rubio himself has been popularly condemned as Narco Rubio. And why is that? Because he himself has been linked to drugs. In fact, Marco Rubio's brother-in-law was imprisoned. He was convicted for being involved in distributing $15 million of cocaine. He was a drug trafficker, and Marco Rubio was very close to his brother-in-law, this drug lord, very friendly with him. In fact, Marco Rubio used his position in the Florida government to lobby regulators to give his drug trafficking brother-in-law a real estate license. So now these are the same people who are saying we have to attack Mexico because of the drug cartels. I mean, the hypocrisy never ends. So who is Trump's nominee for CIA director, John Ratcliffe? He's another neocon. He previously was the director of national intelligence under Trump in his first term. And he wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal in 2020 saying the quiet part loud. He said, China is national security threat number one. He wrote, this neocon wrote in this article, quote, "The People's Republic of China poses the greatest threat to America today and the greatest threat to democracy and freedom worldwide since World War II," end quote. Complete neocon rhetoric. There is no difference between John Ratcliffe and John Bolton. They share the exact same ideology and worldview. Or between John Ratcliffe and Mike Pompeo. So Donald Trump has not changed anything. He has the same neocons running his foreign policy. In the same article, John Ratcliffe boasted that in the first Trump administration, he had spent more and more money on trying to counter China. And he wrote, quote, "China should be America's primary national security focus going forward," end quote. And then with typical neoconservative rhetoric, he claimed that China wants to, quote, "reverse the spread of liberty around the world," end quote. So these are the war hawks that Donald Trump has voluntarily selected to oversee his foreign policy. Neocons who say that the U.S. empire should continue spreading so-called freedom and democracy around the world, and that's why they want to wage war on China. Of course, it has nothing to do with freedom and democracy. The U.S. has backed dictatorships around the world for decades and overthrown democratically elected governments around the world. The CIA itself has organized many coups in Chile and Guatemala and Iran and many other countries, overthrowing democratically elected leaders. It doesn't care about democracy. China is the biggest challenger to the U.S. empire and the global dictatorship that the United States has tried to maintain, especially since the 1990s, when the Soviet Union was overthrown and the U.S. declared that it was in a unipolar world and the United States was the only superpower. And Trump has brought back a lot of neocons who want to try to maintain U.S. unipolarity, just like the neocons in the Democratic administration under Biden and Harris, like Antony Blinken, like Jake Sullivan. They have the same worldview that the U.S. empire must overthrow any independent government and wage war around the world. There is no difference whatsoever between the Biden-Harris administration's foreign policy and the people Trump has picked to oversee his foreign policy. If you look at Donald Trump's nominee for ambassador to the UN, it's another warmongering neoconservative, Elise Stefanik. And Elise Stefanik has been an extreme anti-Palestinian bigot who has strongly supported Israel and its horrific crimes in Gaza. The reason that Trump picked her is because at the UN, she's just going to be waging war against international law, and she's going to do everything she can to try to protect the U.S. and Israel from any consequences for their wars of aggression and horrific crimes around the world, attacking the United Nations to prevent any accountability according to international law. And as a congresswoman, Stefanik has boasted of how extremely pro-Israel she is, and she even called for defunding the UN Palestine Refugee Agency, UNRWA, UNRWA, which was created in order to support Palestinians after they lost their homes because their land was colonized by Israel and they were expelled from their indigenous homeland. And she's now saying this is going to be Trump's ambassador to the UN. She's saying that we should defund the UN Palestine Refugee Agency. So the Trump administration is going to continue the bipartisan imperialist war against United Nations and against international law. And it goes without saying that every single person in Donald Trump's administration, all of the people he has appointed in the cabinet, are extremely pro-Israel, extremely anti-Palestinian, and they will strongly support Netanyahu as he ethnically cleanses Palestinians, expels them from their homeland, colonizes Gaza, annexes the West Bank. This is completely bipartisan, of course, and Trump is not going to change that in any way. In fact, Trump is going to go even further, and he's going to tell Israel, do it, go ahead, colonize everything, expel all the Palestinians. We support everything that you're doing. And unlike the Democrats, we're not even going to pretend to criticize you. Of course, Biden and Harris publicly, they would say, oh, Netanyahu, Netanyahu. Meanwhile, they were giving him $18 billion of weapons. But publicly, their narrative was that we support human rights. Trump is going to abandon that narrative completely. And the neocons he surrounded himself with are going to tell Netanyahu, to finish the job, which is exactly what Trump said, to finish the job, expel all Palestinians, colonize all the land. So once again, Trump is not in any way different. He's not an actual populist. That word means nothing. He is an imperialist who has surrounded himself with neocons in his new administration, just like he did in the first one. So it's really important to push back against the pro-Trump propagandists who claim that Trump is going to fight the deep state. He's going to be anti-war and push for peace. They're ignoring all of the evidence. They're ignoring his first administration when he expanded many wars and he militarily occupied Syria and he killed top Iranian and Iraqi officials and he organized coup attempts and a failed invasion of Venezuela. The list goes on. Trump was never a pro-peace president. And just like in his first term, when Trump voluntarily surrounded himself with neocons, in his second term, once again, Trump has surrounded himself with a who's who of neoconservatives, of warmongers, who are pushing for war on China, war on Iran, neo-colonial interventions in Latin America. It shows how there is going to be no difference between Donald Trump's foreign policy and that of the neocons before him. There were some Trump supporters and some useful idiots in the so-called alternative media who claimed that Trump represents a populist alternative to the neocon status quo. But in reality, Trump is continuing the exact same imperialist status quo, trying to expand the power of the US empire and destabilize independent governments that challenge the global dictatorship of the United States. So, in short, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank you for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.